ado then, I'll move us along into the afternoon session, starting with Dr. Glen Kenny from the University of Ottawa. And Glen, where are you? Over there. Glen will be speaking to us about extreme heat events and indoor temperature limits to protect vulnerable populations. Dr. Kenny is a professor of physiology at the University of Ottawa and holds an industry research chair in heat strain monitoring and management. He's principal investigator of numerous studies directed at understanding the health impacts of heat, overviewed in 450 peer-reviewed papers. He is senior project co-lead for Operation Heat Shield Canada, which sounds quite awesome, awarded in 2021 by Canada Foundation for Innovation. The project draws together global experts to formalize a long-term research partnership and catalyze his team's cutting-edge research on the assessment of the environmental and human factors affecting a person's ability to live and work in the heat. So, Glen, please come and get us started. Thank you.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Real pleasure to be here this afternoon. Thanks for the invitation. We're going to switch gears and talk about heat stress. Obviously, that was a significant factor last year, as we saw. Hopefully this will work this time. Is it the... Oh, the other one? Perfect. Thank you very much. So obviously last year with the extreme heat event, as Sarah indicated this morning, there were a lot of heat-related fatalities. And I think the bigger story was, after all of this, is are Canadians prepared? Are we ready to protect the most vulnerable in the next heat event? And we know the frequency, intensity of heat waves is going to certainly get worse over the next few decades. And certainly the coroner's report to a certain extent answered that question and indicated that perhaps we're not as well prepared, and there's a lot we can do in terms of heat mitigation. And some of those recommendations, certainly we could discuss those, for example, fan use and the use of cooling centers. But for today, we're going to really focus on our work looking at the physiological responses to extreme heat. So to get everybody on the same page, we're going to just first look at what is human thermoregulation and what is the human heat stress response. Then we'll look at some of the individual factors, environmental factors that affects a person's ability to dissipate heat. And then I'm going to show you some real new data, some novel data that we have collected over the last 3 years, looking at the heat stress response during day-long heat simulations in elderly adults, as well as look at and discuss what should be the safe indoor temperature limit. So, just to get us on the same page, obviously none of you right now are hyperthermic. That's because, again, your body is able to balance the rate of heat gain and heat loss. So if we simply look at when you're sitting down or you're doing any kind of exercise, assuming this is I guess there's no pointer working on this one. Sorry about that. No, the other one. All right, thank you. A little workout here. Fantastic, thank you. So obviously, as you're sitting down there, you're generating heat. Obviously, it's a little cooler in here, so your body's able to deal with the heat that's being gained through, again, you'll have the heat loss mechanism. So when you are exposed to a bit of heat, there's that evaporation of sweat. So you're producing sweat, the body's evaporating that sweat to keep you somewhat cool. Then there's what we call dry heat exchange. That's managed through the increases in skin blood flow. And ultimately, when we do see, and again, I'm going to try to manage these two, when we are in more extreme conditions, like what we saw in BC last summer, the problem remains that essentially our capacity to dissipate heat is very much limited by the fact that we're dependent upon the production of sweat and the evaporation of that sweat to keep us cool. Now, the one challenge as well is that while dry heat exchange is important, again, it's not necessarily going to facilitate a greater rate of heat loss. It's actually going to protect you against a greater rate of heat gain. As we increase skin blood flow, essentially skin warms and the skin to air temperature gradient becomes less, and therefore you gain less heat. And I'll show you an example of that when we get to some other figures shortly. All right, so one thing we have to consider, important because one thing that we do know, as we see from the different factors that were talked about from Sarah this morning, there are a number of factors that can affect our ability to dissipate heat. And we see down here at the bottom that there are individual factors, inter-individual factors, sex, age, chronic disease, physical characteristics, as well as other individual factors such as hydration, acclimation, medication, and those that we really can't control. Those are the duration of the exposure, the intensity of that exposure, things that essentially could affect our ability to dissipate heat. I'm going to show you how that plays out. But ultimately, if we look at point A over here, so the same individual, so here, let's say, for example, this point A is a healthy individual, healthy older adult. And then we have point B, the older adult with type 2 diabetes. So what we do know is that diabetes impairs one's ability to dissipate heat. So for the same level of heat stress, this individual will eventually reach stable levels at an elevated core temperature, but it'll take longer, and perhaps this person here might never achieve heat balance, and their temperature, they'll store more heat, so their temperature, core temperature, is higher. So for the same level of heat stress, they will respond very differently. So there's a number of factors here that we have to consider. We're going to look at some of these. We can't consider all of them today, but we'll touch on a few of these. Beyond that, I think we've maybe touched on it a bit today, but we really have to think about our environment. Now, one thing is geographical location. So if we're talking about Vancouver versus St. John's, Newfoundland versus Ottawa or Toronto, where we're in that hot, humid air mass during the summertime, your level of adaptation is going to differ. So when you are exposed to an extreme heat event, your response might be different than somebody who perhaps has come over from Vancouver for a brief time in Toronto, and there's an extreme heat event in Toronto, as an example. So one thing also we have to consider is as well this urban variation. Ultimately, within a given city, there can be temperature differentials within different neighborhoods, and your risk of a heat-related death may be higher in one area versus another, and there's different factors associated with that, and that is whether there is green space, whether it's quite dense in terms of number of building structures and what have you. There's also building type. Are you in a high-rise residence? Do you have a basement in your house? Is it built with aluminum siding? Is it brick? Is it stone, etc.? All of these factors affect the level of heat stress that you will be exposed to, and that becomes a difficult factor to characterize. Important, though. And also there's that heat source. So when we're trying to characterize what's happening in the home, the challenge we also have is understanding what have these individuals been doing? What level of heat exposure have they been exposed to? And that's important, but ultimately the one factor as well that's perhaps one of the bigger ones is general health conditions that can certainly alter your ability to thermoregulate. All right. We saw this figure this morning from Sarah, and I think the major point here that I want to drive home is that ultimately, while we may measure outdoor temperature and try to make some assumptions based on outdoor temperature, as my previous graph showed, there's a lot of factors that will affect your level of exposure. Again, what is the individual doing in their home? Are they moving around? Are they active? Are they generating heat? Are there other heat sources? And as we know, in this study here that was done in 2016, where they assessed indoor temperatures in the home, and it was not a overly hot summer in Detroit that year. It was just a normal summer. And what they saw is there's a huge variation in indoor temperatures. And these elderly adults, some of them had some of the room temperatures reach 35. And certainly we saw that, as Sarah showed us this morning, that essentially you have the outdoor temperature here in the black line, and then the indoor temperature being the red over here. And you can see that, again, that level of exposure may be very different between individuals. So when we try to assess the risk, it becomes difficult because we don't know how long that heat stress has been there, what level of heat stress, and what were the mitigating factors that would put this individual under greater stress so that they eventually suffer from a heat-related death. All right. So what are some of the individual factors, and how does that affect one's ability to dissipate heat? So, one thing we know as we get older, unfortunately, like anything else, our cardiorespiratory fitness goes down. Well, guess what? Your ability to dissipate heat decreases about 4% per decade. That's significant. And what we do see, and again here, so what you're looking at is our work here showing that, again, at different levels of heat stress. Now, what's important to understand here is we're using exercise heat load because you can generate a high rate of heat gain in a short period of time to assess the impacts on heat loss. What we do know as we get older, that decrement certainly is significant, and certainly in women, their capacity to dissipate heat is about 5% lower than men. And what we do know, though, is that the sex and age-related differences are primarily observed at the moderate to high heat stress. That means under conditions where there's a higher rate of heat gain. At low levels of heat gain, the differences are not so evident. All right. Everybody knows about fitness. We're talking about fitness. We talk about it all the time, about keeping fit and about trying to manage disease through fitness. And one thing here, again, you're looking at low, moderate, and high levels of physical activity just as our model to understand the impacts on heat stress. So you have here middle-aged inactive person and middle-aged active. So you can see that across these 3 different levels of heat stress. Now, what's important here to understand is, so here's our heat load. What you want to see, remember heat gain, heat loss, you want them to match. So as you see here, none of them actually achieve that balance, but what we're seeing here as we get into moderate and high heat stress, fitness does play a role. So if you are inactive and sedentary, you're going to see greater age-associated declines in your capacity to dissipate heat. Very important. And certainly it becomes worse, the effects becomes more pronounced at high heat loads when the conditions are extreme. Now, similarly, when we look at age-associated disease, so let's think about type 2 diabetes. We know that individuals with type 2 diabetes were amongst those that were that experienced some of these higher rates of heat-related deaths during this Western heat dome. So again, here, low, moderate, and high heat stress. So the red dots represent your person, the individual with type 2 diabetes, whereas the blue is the healthy control counterpart. And you can see as you get into higher levels of heat stress, well, about a 20% difference between the individual with type 2 diabetes and the relative to the healthy individual. So that's important because that means that's capacity that is lost. That places you at greater risk. Maybe the exposure time will have to be lower. But what's important here as well is that we can reverse that. In this work here, we showed that through exercise training or just being physically active, you can actually reverse this diabetes-related impairment to facilitate a greater rate of heat loss, which at the end of the day, if you think about it, that may mean improved survival when you are exposed to extreme heat. Now, one thing probably many of you don't talk about is the impacts of successive days of heat exposure. Now, we know in our work that successive days of physical exertion results in a gradual decline in your capacity to dissipate heat. So think about it. If you have an older person who is out gardening day in and day out, or a worker, what you're going to see is a progressive decay. So here's day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. And so our work showed that there's a gradual decay. We don't think about that. We don't think about the impact of how many days of heat are we going to have, and what might that impact be on our ability to tolerate those conditions. So that's an important factor and something that we certainly have to consider when we're looking at these extreme heat events. All right. In the report that we saw from the BC Coroner's report, there was a lot of talk about temperature, but humidity was not necessarily discussed. And it's important to understand that you can still have extreme heat events wherein temperatures are lower, but humidity is high. Why is that important to understand the impact of humidity? Because humidity is going to restrict the amount of sweat that will be evaporated. So we have the world's only calorimeter. So I want you to picture this big Pepsi can or Coke can, 1.5 meters in diameter, about 1.9 meters tall. And essentially, we can measure a person's heat dissipation, dry and evaporative heat exchange. It allows us to measure body heat storage. So that's what you're seeing. You're seeing in a 2-hour exposure. This is an early study a number of years ago that we did, and we exposed these elderly adults to 2 hours. It was the first trials. Again, you got to understand that people were afraid to expose the elderly to extreme heat, but we managed to demonstrate these age-related differences. But look what happens when you're in the humid condition. Both young and old will store more heat. So that pushes, if you remember that figure where I showed you the big arrow, you're gaining more heat. Your temperature is going to go up higher, putting you at greater risk. So humidity is a critical factor. Now, what about we're talking about air quality today. And that's an important factor that's going to affect health. And we know that also that affects an individual that's under heat stress. That affects respiratory function and can, again, alter the way they might thermoregulate. Now, there's no direct evidence in that, but it's a stressor, a physiological stressor that ultimately will exacerbate a person's response to heat stress. And we saw and we know that during the Western Heat Dome that fires were certainly predominant, and that certainly affected the air quality. Ultimately, again, if we look and see, we know that individuals with respiratory disease are a much higher risk of a heat-related death than their healthy younger counterparts, certainly. And we know that people with cardiovascular disease are also going to be at high risk. So air quality, as we see here, under high emission scenario over the next number of years, you're going to see that, again, by the end of the century, we're going to experience a large number of, an increase in the number of intense heat waves. And if we have poor air quality, that's going to exacerbate the risk of somebody dying during an extreme heat event, because it is a physiological stressor affecting respiratory function, ultimately affecting cardiovascular function during a heat exposure. All right, let's characterize that heat stress response. Probably some of you have not seen that. So what might you expect to see? What's happening to your body when you are exposed to heat? So what you're looking at here is exactly what we measure in a calorimeter, what you see. So let's say right now you're in this cool room. It's fantastic. You feel great. Now I'm going to take you and I'm going to put you in a room that's 44 degrees Celsius. All right? So we're going to walk in there, and what you're going to see right off the bat is your body is going to show a rapid rate of heat gain. Now, slowly as your body gets warmer, that rate of heat gain is going to drop. Now, what if you remember at the start, I said in order for the body to achieve heat balance, the rate of heat loss has to match with the rate of heat gain. So eventually, a young person, after about 3 hours, will achieve heat balance. All right? So that's important. Now, if we look at an older person, so they're gaining heat, body's warming up, so rate of heat gain slowing down, they're increasing their heat loss. That's evaporative heat loss. However, they never achieve heat balance after 3 hours. That was a bit of a surprise. So that means that while core temperature was rising very quickly, it then started to go off slowly, but it's still rising. All right? Now let's look at that patient with type 2 diabetes. At first glance, if you look at the numbers, they're telling you, wow, they're storing the same amount of heat. That's that area in pink. You're looking at the area in pink represents how much heat they're storing. Exact same. Aha. So that means that they have the exact same core temperature. But does that mean that they have the same risk? No. This is the problem. Just because two people have the same core temperature doesn't mean they don't have different risks. So what you're seeing here is that the pathway to hyperthermia is different. So here's the blue line. So the rate of heat gain is much higher in the patient with type 2 diabetes. So they're gaining more heat. To compensate for that, what do they got to do? They got to increase the rate of heat loss. And how are they going to do that? Sweat more. Well, that's not a good thing. If you're sitting in the heat and you got to sweat more, what's going to happen to hydration status? It's going to be affected. So the pathway to hyperthermia is different in these individuals, and that's something we have to consider. All right. I'm going to show you some new data. We just finished a 3-year trial exposing elderly adults up to the age of 80 to extreme heat. I'm going to show you, it's a day-long simulation. It was very revealing because some of these patients at the very end did not realize how much at risk they were. But let's take a look. So again, we expose these elderly adults to a day-long heat exposure, so 9 hours simulated heat event. So what you see is here's exactly after 3 hours, they're all storing heat, and you can see core temperature rising. Eventually, the older adults will achieve heat balance, so that's good. But that's within the 9 hours. We don't know what's going to happen after that, but they do achieve heat balance. But remember, core temperature is elevated. Just because they achieve heat balance does not mean they're not at risk. That's a stress on the body. The heart is going to be working hard to try to increase skin blood flow. So I'm always balancing these things out. I feel like I'm juggling. So what we also know when we assess patients with chronic health conditions, those with type 2 diabetes or those that had hypertension. Now, I want to add to this, these are individuals with well-controlled, uncomplicated conditions, in part because we were all concerned, both Health Canada and our university research ethic boards, about exposing people who are at risk. But what we did see is that they had the same core temperature response. So that's somewhat good because then if we sort of use that one-size-fits-all approach, if we're going to give recommendations, we can at least group these individuals together. But ultimately, when we look at the cardiovascular response, here's where the story becomes even more important. So remember what I said to you at the very start. When we are exposed to heat, yes, we have to sweat. There's an impaired ability to sweat. One thing that has to happen, though, is when we're exposed to heat, there's that skin vasodilation. So you have these hundreds of miles of skin vasculature. Well, you've got to service that skin vasculature. You got to maintain pressure to drive that blood through that skin vasculature. And how's it going to do it? Well, the heart's got to do it's got to pump, right? It's got to do its work. And so what we do see is the heart is not that effective. And what we do see over here is these individuals are showing very marked reductions in blood pressure. Imagine that reduction in blood pressure, 20 mils, 40 mils. Now, I'm presenting you mean data and standard deviations, but you have to look at the individual points because those are the individuals that are at risk. These individuals down here, these older adults are the ones that are going to be at risk of collapse at the end of a heat exposure. And we had a number of them that collapsed at the 9th hour. Surprisingly, a lot of them through the whole heat simulation said, no problem, I'm okay. And then suddenly in the last 8 hours, that's when they start showing signs of heat-induced syncope. So these are individuals that are at risk. So the next question that comes into play with all what we're seeing in terms of what we know about the physiology of an individual being exposed to heat is what should that indoor temperature limit be? That's an important question. Should it be 22? Should it be 26, 31, 36? What should it be? So we ask that question and we assess that and want to find out exactly what was the burden on the body's systems, physiological systems. So here we expose individuals to 22, 26. Now 26 was a number of years ago, Toronto Public Health had recommended an indoor temperature limit of 26 degrees Celsius as being the safe indoor temperature. Surprisingly, the World Health Organization had recommended 31, 32 for a number of years, and based on what we saw, and just recently, they removed that off their website in 2021 and changed the recommendations for no obvious reason. Now, we also know that 36, as we saw from some of the data that's been presented at the time when we were developing the study, that 36 represented some of the hottest indoor temperatures that were observed. So, when we look at the data, what we're looking at here, and this only represents a snippet of all the data, it doesn't show you all the respiratory, the cell function, everything. It's showing you the pivotal data, that core temperature, because that's a good indicator of what's happening. So, day-long exposure, elderly adults up to the age of 80 being exposed, and you can see here that at 26, relatively benign in terms of temperature increase. Now, think about it for 1 second, however. Why is core temperature not going up at 26? It's because the body is defending against it. So it's still a stress, but the body's able to compensate. It is responding. So that means it's still under stress. However, when we get to 31, you can see here, now core temperature is going up. That means it's having difficulty responding, right? It has difficulty getting the system activated so that it can lose enough heat to achieve heat balance. So that now you can see that many of them, these individuals here, are plateauing at higher core temperatures. And if sustained over long periods of time, that can have a negative effect on their overall physiological function, and even at the cell level, cause stress to the cell. Moving up, then we see at 36, clearly that now becomes a greater stressor. So let's look at the impact of this on the cardiovascular system. All right, so what are we seeing? So many of you, when you start exercise, what do? You increase heart rate. Why are we increasing heart rate? Because we need to supply the muscles with the oxygen nutrient, and we have to be able to increase skin blood flow to get rid of some of that heat. Well, we do the exact same thing in a passive heat stress like this, the extreme heat event. You're going to see that heart rate will go up. Certainly at 31, 36, we see it. But again, what's important here, folks, is when we look at these temperatures at 22 and 26, so we're able to maintain blood pressure at 22, but even at 26, look at these individuals. These individuals are unable to maintain blood pressure even at 26. So there are some that would still not be relatively safe in a 26 degrees Celsius environment. So there are individuals that may not even be able to tolerate that stressor. It's not that their core temperature is up. Remember, just because core temperature is not up doesn't mean the system's not activated and working hard. It is. And the system, as a result of that, is under undue stress, and that's the cardiovascular system. The heart is working hard. Think about it this way. If you're fortunate to have 3 or 4 showers or bathrooms in your house, and everybody was showering at the same time, all the valves are opened up, people showering, well, the pressure is going to drop, right? Your flow through the house is dependent on how much flow you're going to get, the city's going to provide you. Well, ultimately, if you have all the skin vasculature dilating, the body's struggling to keep that blood flow going to the skin. And as a result, it's compromising your ability to regulate blood pressure. And that can lead to, the burden placed on the heart can lead to people potentially having heart attacks. And it can also cause people, if they can't maintain blood pressure, to collapse, fall, hit their head, and potentially die from a heat-induced injury. All right. Are the responses the same in individuals with chronic disease? These would be, again, to make it clear, these would be individuals with uncomplicated, controlled type 2 diabetes and hypertension. And the short answer is yes. At least we do see that they have a similar response in terms of core temperature at the 31 and 36. So again, we can at least group these individuals together. And we can see that they still have the same challenges when it comes to being able to regulate blood pressure. All right? So very important from that perspective. So what might our take-home message be for you today? Important message. So a single-day exposure, certainly at 26 or less, relatively safe for the vast majority of individuals, but there is a small minority that may still be impacted by that. 26 or above 26 and under 31, essentially, we should not allow an individual to be exposed for a prolonged period of time because the stress in itself could cause them to experience heat-related illnesses. Above 31, there's no question in my mind that if you were to expose older or elderly adults or individuals with chronic disease, that they are going to experience heat-related illnesses. And the extent to which that illness, the severity of that will depend, again, on the duration of that exposure. But ultimately, to finish off, the one thing that we have to do is assess this response over successive days, because I believe that those recommendations need to be adjusted based off the successive exposure to an extreme heat event. Because the body, as we know, will deteriorate. And if anybody does any exercise training, you know that you don't do heavy day, because you know that next day you're not going to be able to do lift the same weight or run the same distance without appropriate recovery. And therefore, the body under stress will do the exact same thing when exposed to heat. All right, I finish off with that. Thank you very much for your attention, and open for questions.
We have some questions.
Sorry, as the day goes on, I'm going to get more questions. Thank you very much. I'm curious, so, I hope it doesn't get lost too much on the audience as I'm going to start referring to adaptive comfort mode and all that, but I'm curious in terms of the relationship between these findings and the radiant temperature around the human body and the decoupling of air and radiant, and whether that can play a factor. Is it an absolute 26-degree air temperature, or is it in combination with the context of what the radiant temperature is? That's one. And the second is that last slide would indicate that the adaptive comfort model, as much as one could be comfortable as that's evaluated between 26 and 31, it seems to be suggesting that there could be conditions where, as comfortable as that might not be, it's not healthy for you to be exposed above 26. I'm wondering if you could just put that in context to the adaptive comfort model and regimes where one would say it's comfortable above 26 in the right settings.
That's a good question. I mean, in terms of, again, just looking in terms of radiative heat gain or the environment, again, we're talking about an absolute temperature. And of course, any radiant heat source is going to potentially exacerbate that response depending on how close it is to the individual, because the radiant heat source can increase the rate of heat gain very rapidly. You'll see that in a worker going from, the sun's coming out, it's shaded 1 second, and then the sun's coming out again. In terms of thermal comfort, I do want to say one thing as it relates to the recommendations that are out. And one thing that we do know in all of these studies, if you look at, this is data we didn't present here today, but if you look at thermal comfort, the way the older adult perceives the environment, they would say to you, number one, that they're sitting in the heat at 44 degrees, they don't see a problem. They're benign. Their responses are relatively like, nothing's happened, I'm okay. The problem only comes later on. So if you look at their thermal comfort overall, they would tell you, they would rate that they feel well. and that they're comfortable with the environment. They're not reporting any discomforts and unpleasant feelings while sitting in the heat. They might say, yeah, it's a little warm, but I'm okay. And they're sitting down there, playing on YouTube or reading a book, no problem. And therein lies the problem, the lack of recognition that they're actually under stress. Surprisingly, a young adult is able to detect that very differently. And they will respond, and there's more complaints. We do compare responses with the young adults, and you'll see that they will complain more quickly about the environment, the hotter environment, than an older person would. And certainly an individual with chronic health conditions are the worst. They underreport any sort of symptoms associated with the harmful environment, so the dangerous environment. They tend to sit there and they're more complacent. So that's an importance, that subjective, that sensation, thermal sensation differs pretty significantly between a young and an older person. Yes?
One more, okay. I'll keep it quick then. Thank you for the really interesting talk. I'm curious, and this is based a little bit on personal experience. I did a postdoc in Singapore for 3 years.
Yeah.
Where there's air conditioning in my bedroom, not in the living room. So I spent a lot less time in air conditioning environments. I noticed the set point that my partner and I were comfortable at over the 3 years crept up over the 3 years we were there. So I'm curious, is that a real phenomenon? And I'm thinking back to some of the data I showed where, over decades time scale, we're going to expect shifts in indoor temperatures. So do you expect, or do you know, is there an acclimatization process where these physical response mechanisms actually change, or was that all in my head?
No, it's certainly not in your head. There are changes, and as we saw from the demonstration, looking at individuals with type 2 diabetes that have significant impairments, you can adapt. You can control, if you had a patient with diabetes and you expose them to control hyperthermia, no question, you can improve their capacity to dissipate heat. But it's a two-edged sword. Again, remember that a 35 degrees Celsius ambient temperature indoor for a person living in Kuwait is tolerable. There are elderly people living in Kuwait, they're not dying. But you take a person here living at 35 degrees, long-term care or living alone, doesn't matter. They may not survive that. And that, again, is because, like anything else, if you're not active, physically active, there won't be improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness. Well, if you're not exposed to heat, your body will not show those alterations or improvements that would be necessary for you to survive under hotter conditions. So those are progressive changes that you're going to see. The problem as well, remember, sweating more is not necessarily a good thing either, because you can sweat more. The problem is that leads to a different dangerous endpoint, and that's greater dehydration. And the one thing that we know with older adults in our study, they barely drank anything. So they were severely dehydrated by the end of the exposure, despite the fact that they had available fluids, just like they were free living, but they opted not to consume the fluids and to maintain normal hydration status.
One question from an online attendee here. They say, connecting this to Sarah Henderson's presentation that showed a prolonged increased risk of death, possibly as a result of cardiovascular injury, can Dr. Kenny speak to whether there is much evidence of injury to the cardiovascular system from exposures to heat stress?
That's a good question. I think the bigger challenge that we face when we're exposed to heat is the stress that's placed on the cardiovascular system. Because again, remembering that when you're at elevated core temperature, even though you're stable, people think that my core temperature is not rising, I'm safe, so it's okay. But it's not okay because the system is working hard. The heart is pumping significantly. And for some people, maybe they have pre-exposing conditions that might cause them, that level of stress may be sufficient to cause heart problems or cause the person to have a heart attack or what have you. But in terms of long-term effects on the cardiovascular system to heat exposure, I wouldn't know necessarily what the right answer would be for that one. But again, just realizing that it doesn't take much for the system to be under stress during a single exposure.
Okay, let's thank Glen again.
Thank you.